The moment reality broke did not happen in a laboratory or a secret military base. It happened in a public place, under fluorescent lights, surrounded by ordinary people who had no idea they were about to witness something that should not have existed. On the morning of November 18, 2006, a man walked into the Gare de Lyon railway station in Paris and calmly approached the ticket counter. He was dressed plainly, dark coat, no visible luggage. Nothing about him stood out except for one detail that immediately confused the clerk. When asked for his identification, the man handed over a passport that appeared authentic in every measurable way. The paper stock was correct. The ink passed ultraviolet inspection. The stamps matched known border formats. The problem was the date of birth. According to the passport, the man had been born in the year 2043. At first, the clerk assumed it was a misprint or a poorly executed fake. But when the passport was scanned, the system did not reject it. Instead, it returned an error message that no one at the counter had ever seen before. The database showed a placeholder record, empty fields, and a timestamp marked "not yet generated." Security was called. The man did not resist. He did not argue. He did not panic. He simply waited. When questioned, he stated his name, which matched no known records. He claimed to be a civil engineer specializing in infrastructure restoration. When asked where he was coming from, he gave an answer that made the room fall silent. "I arrived this morning from a version of this city that no longer exists." The officers assumed mental illness. That assumption lasted exactly 12 minutes. When they asked me to describe Paris, I did not describe the Paris of 2006. I described a city that had not yet been built. I mentioned a redesigned river barrier system that would not be approved until 2018. I referenced an underground transit expansion that did not exist on any public planning documents. I spoke about climate retrofits to Haussmann buildings that engineers would not begin discussing for another decade. I described structural reinforcements beneath the city to protect against flooding that would not occur until the 2030s. Every detail I gave was wrong for the present and disturbingly accurate for a future that had not yet arrived. This should not have been possible. History, physics, and every model of time humanity relies on says the past is fixed and the future does not send visitors backward. Yet here I was, a man who did not speak like a dreamer or a prophet. I spoke like a professional, describing work I had already completed. The haunting question emerged not from what he said, but from how he said it. He spoke with no urgency, no excitement, no desire to convince anyone. As if he already knew no one would believe him. When asked the most obvious question, how he arrived, he paused. "Time is not what you think it is," he said. "It doesn't move forward. It accumulates." That sentence would later appear in a classified memo circulated among transportation security agencies in 3 countries before being quietly withdrawn. Textbooks tell us time travel is impossible because causality must be preserved. The arrow of time moves in one direction. Entropy increases. Effects follow causes. That is the story we are taught. But that story is incomplete. What textbooks rarely mention is that physics itself has never actually proven that time only flows one way. The equations that govern reality do not forbid reverse motion. They simply do not explain why we experience time the way we do. In fact, some of the most fundamental laws of physics work equally well forward and backward. This creates a problem that science has never fully resolved. If the laws do not forbid time reversal, then what does? For most of history, the question was philosophical, but in the 20th century, something changed. In 1949, physicist Kurt Gödel demonstrated mathematically that certain solutions to Einstein's equations allow for closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that loop back on themselves. Not science fiction, not speculation, valid solutions within general relativity. Gödel was not ignored because he was wrong. He was ignored because the implications were unbearable. If closed time-like curves exist, then time travel is not forbidden. It is contextual. Later discoveries only made the situation worse. Experiments in quantum mechanics began to show that particles do not behave like objects moving through time. They behave like probability distributions existing across time. Some experiments suggested that decisions made in the present could influence outcomes recorded in the past. Physicists labeled this retrocausality and quickly moved on, but archaeology was quietly discovering something just as disturbing. Across multiple ancient sites, researchers began finding objects that did not fit their time periods, tools made with techniques that should not exist yet, materials processed in ways that required knowledge not present at the time, architectural alignments that required centuries of astronomical observation to calculate, yet appeared suddenly, without developmental stages. In Peru, polygonal stone masonry appeared fully formed. No prototypes, no gradual learning curve. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe emerged from the earth like a contradiction made of stone. Monumental architecture built by societies that supposedly had no agriculture, no cities, no centralized authority. Each case was treated as an anomaly, a curiosity, an exception. But exceptions are only harmless until they start forming patterns. When researchers overlaid timelines from different continents, something strange emerged. The anomalies clustered around specific periods, periods following environmental catastrophe, periods after climate shifts, periods where civilizations collapsed and rebuilt. It was as if knowledge was not progressing smoothly, but appearing in bursts. This idea was dismissed publicly. Privately, it terrified people, because if advanced knowledge appeared suddenly, without precursors, then it had to come from somewhere. And if it did not come from the past, there were only two remaining possibilities. The man in the Paris station was asked if he recognized ancient sites. He was shown photographs: Göbekli Tepe, Giza, Teotihuacan, Machu Picchu. He studied them quietly. "These are not beginnings," he said. "They're repairs." You assume civilization grows once. It doesn't. It fractures. When it breaks badly enough, fragments move. But he was deeply unsettled by one thing: the sky. When taken outside briefly, he stared upward longer than necessary. When asked why, he gave an answer that was almost dismissed as poetic, until later events forced it back into focus. "There are fewer lights. You haven't lost them yet." The man was eventually transferred to a medical facility. His passport was confiscated. His statements were classified. His existence was officially erased. But the story did not end there, because in the months that followed, independent researchers began noticing something strange in global databases. Records were changing, not being edited, being replaced. Satellite images showed subtle discrepancies when compared to archived copies. Geological surveys began to display inconsistencies in sediment layers that did not match known climate models. Astronomical data showed timing offsets in pulsar signals that suggested micro-variations in space-time measurement. Each anomaly was minor, each could be explained away, until someone overlaid them. What emerged was a pattern of temporal noise, not chaos, interference, as if the timeline itself was being adjusted. This led to a forbidden hypothesis discussed quietly in theoretical circles. What if time is not a line? What if it is a field? And what if, under extreme conditions, information can move through that field in ways matter cannot? The idea was not that people physically traveled backward like machines in fiction. The idea was that civilization, when pushed to collapse, learns how to send fragments of itself into its own past, not bodies. Blueprints, concepts, small interventions designed to stabilize future outcomes. Time travel not as tourism, but as damage control. This would explain why advanced knowledge appears suddenly after disasters, why ancient civilizations show impossible jumps, why myths describe teachers appearing after floods. why so many cultures speak of visitors who arrive, instruct, and vanish, and why a man might appear in a train station, not to save the world, but to ensure it does not break too early. The terrifying implication is this: if the future can send fragments backward, then history is not fixed. It is negotiated. The man was asked one final question before his records disappeared. Why now? He answered quietly, because this is the last version where the repair still works. He smiled then, not with hope, but with relief, as if something had already succeeded. And somewhere, in a future we have not yet reached, someone was watching the past stabilize just enough to continue. The real question is not whether time travel exists. The real question is whether we are living in the first timeline. The files connected to the man from the station were supposed to be gone, deleted, sealed, overwritten. That was the official record. But time has a strange habit of leaving residue. Several years after the incident, a data analyst working for a European infrastructure agency noticed something that made no sense. While auditing legacy backups of transit security systems, he found a corrupted index entry that refused to resolve. It was not empty, it was incomplete, as if it pointed to a record that existed and did not exist at the same time. When he attempted to reconstruct the fragment, the system returned a timestamp that could not be parsed. It was dated 11 years in the future. At first, he assumed a clock error. Then he noticed something else. The fragment referenced a structural model for a flood defense system beneath Paris, a design nearly identical to one that would not be proposed publicly until years later, after catastrophic flooding forced emergency action. Except this model was more advanced. It solved problems engineers would struggle with for a decade. Someone had known. This discovery was quietly forwarded to a small research group that existed unofficially within the margins of academia. Physicists, archaeologists, data scientists, people who were not trying to prove time travel existed, but trying to understand why history behaved as if it had been edited. They called it temporal resilience theory. The idea was simple and disturbing. Civilizations do not collapse once. They collapse repeatedly. And when they do, the most valuable resource is not energy or territory, but continuity. If you accept that time is not a line but a layered structure, then it becomes theoretically possible for information to leak across layers, not through machines, but through extreme events. When systems destabilize hard enough, boundaries weaken. The group began comparing collapse periods across history: climate instability, magnetic anomalies, solar activity, geological stress, social fragmentation. What they found was unnerving. Every major civilizational collapse coincided with spikes in natural phenomena known to distort space-time at microscopic levels: solar proton events, rapid geomagnetic reversals, massive seismic shifts, sudden climate transitions. These events were not strong enough to rip holes in reality, but they were enough to blur it. And blurred systems behave differently. The hypothesis suggested that during moments of planetary stress, time becomes more permeable, not open, just flexible enough for information to slip through. Not messages sent deliberately, but echoes. Fragments of knowledge push backward along the same channels that collapse would later erase. This reframed ancient history completely. The sudden appearance of advanced architecture after floods, the rapid emergence of writing systems, the unexplained jumps in mathematics and astronomy. These were not beginnings, they were recoveries. What terrified the researchers was the implication for the present, because all indicators pointed to another collapse scale stress window approaching. The man from the station had said something that returned now with unsettling clarity. This is the last version where the repair still works. What did that mean? The answer came not from physics, but from pattern analysis. When the team mapped historical recoveries, they noticed something else. Each cycle took longer to stabilize. Each collapse erased more knowledge. Each rebuild relied on fewer intact fragments. Civilization was not looping perfectly. It was degrading. Entropy was winning. If time corrections were happening, they were becoming less effective. The future, it seemed, was running out of chances. This brought the researchers to a conclusion that none of them wanted to reach. Time travel was not being used to change the past. It was being used to preserve it just enough to delay extinction. And the man was not a visitor. He was a courier. Once that idea settled, everything else fell into place. Why he carried no weapons. Why he made no demands. Why he did not try to warn governments. He was not there to stop disasters. He was there to seed survivability, small adjustments, subtle nudges, corrections embedded into infrastructure, culture, and knowledge systems, things that would look inevitable later, unremarkable, as if they had always been that way. This also explained why there were no armies from the future, no machines, no paradoxes, only people who arrived quietly, performed specific tasks, and disappeared. Time travel not as spectacle, but as maintenance. The group searched for more evidence. They found it in places no one had thought to look. In patent records filed decades before the technology existed. In architectural blueprints that anticipated disasters that had not yet happened. In mythologies describing teachers who arrived after great floods and left when rebuilding was complete. Even in language, certain words appeared across cultures with meanings that made no evolutionary sense. Terms for cycles, resets, returns, corrections, as if humanity had been taught, again and again, to rebuild without remembering why. The most chilling discovery came from astrophysics. Satellite measurements of cosmic background radiation revealed something subtle but profound. Tiny irregularities, not random noise. Repeating structures, almost like scars. Some cosmologists suggested these were relics of early universe fluctuations. Others quietly wondered if they were evidence of temporal stress, regions where space-time itself had been bent, corrected, smoothed. If that were true, then time travel was not new. It was ancient, older than civilization, possibly older than humanity. The group reached out to retired officials, archivists, and intelligence analysts, people who no longer had careers to protect. Stories emerged, men and women detained briefly, questioned, then quietly released. Individuals who predicted infrastructure failures with uncomfortable accuracy, documents that appeared in databases before the systems that created them existed. None of these people claimed to be heroes. They claimed to be tired. That was the common thread, as if they had done this before. The most disturbing revelation came from a single recovered audio fragment found on an obsolete server scheduled for destruction. The voice was calm, familiar. The man from the station. "You keep asking if this can be prevented," he said. "That's the wrong question. The correct question is whether this version can carry the memory forward." Someone asked him what happened in his time. "We solved energy. We solved disease. We solved aging. And we still collapsed." When asked why, his answer was devastatingly simple. "We optimized everything except wisdom." That was the twist no one expected. The future was not ruined by war, not by asteroids, not by artificial intelligence. It collapsed under its own complexity. Systems became too interconnected to fail gracefully. One disruption cascaded into many. Recovery became impossible because no one understood the whole anymore. That was why the past mattered. Earlier civilizations were simpler, more resilient, more adaptable. The goal was not to advance faster. The goal was to anchor stability deeper. This reframed the entire concept of progress. Humanity was not meant to race forward endlessly. It was meant to loop carefully, advance, collapse. Remember just enough to rebuild better. But the loops were breaking. Modern civilization, for the first time, was at risk of collapsing faster than memory could be preserved. Digital storage decayed too quickly. Formats became unreadable. Knowledge became dependent on fragile infrastructure. If a collapse happened now, far more would be lost than ever before. That was the warning. Not that disaster was coming, but that this was the last era capable of preserving continuity. The final intervention, according to the recovered data, was already underway. It did not involve machines or time portals. It involved people. The future was seeding the present with individuals capable of thinking cyclically instead of linearly. People drawn to history, systems, resilience. People asking uncomfortable questions. People watching videos like this one. The man's final message, recorded before the audio cut out, was quiet. "If you're hearing this," he said, "then the signal held. That means you still have time. Not time to escape, time to choose what gets carried forward." The happy ending was not salvation. It was responsibility. The realization that humanity had survived, not because it was the smartest species, but because it learned how to rebuild again and again and again. The big question remains unanswered. If the future is already correcting the past, then what happens when the past becomes too unstable to fix? What did the original one look like? Somewhere in a future that may never exist. Someone is watching to see whether we preserve the memory this time. Because if we fail, there may be no one left to send help back, and the silence of history will finally be permanent. Some questions don't come with clear answers. Some stories don't end. They linger. What matters is not what we think we know, but what we're willing to question. If this story made you pause, reflect, or look at the world a little differently, then it's done its job. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy thoughtful stories grounded in reality, curiosity, and careful analysis, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.